Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Power Hour 6, Long-Term Regional Transmission Planning, State Initiatives, and the Power Grid. First, to introduce myself, my name is Brian Hepner. I'm the Communications Manager for the Illinois Power Agency. I'll be responsible for hosting this presentation today. To get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. We will be taking questions from our audience toward the end, so please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar. To submit questions, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Today's session is being recorded, and the recording and presentation slides will be available on the IPA website under About IPA/events. A couple of points I want to emphasize, if you could advance the slide, Tori. Today's webinar is the 6th Power Hour of the year. This webinar is for general education purposes only and does not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policy by the IPA or its staff. This 60-minute webinar will provide an overview on the role of regional transmission organizations in long-term regional transmission planning, current challenges, and opportunities on the horizon. It will also highlight the role of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, in long-term regional transmission planning, unpack FERC Order 1920, and how it reshapes the issue of transmission planning and reform. Lastly, the webinar will highlight Illinois' policies and initiatives around long-term regional transmission issues, discuss the key actors and efforts that are underway and forthcoming to address the issues at a state level. We could go on to that. Thank you. Next, I'll just provide a brief overview on the IPA Power Hour webinar series and its scope. Power Hour is a series of educational and informative webinars on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. The IPA started this series in 2021 with an intention to shed light on energy issues and themes with education as the focus. To date, we have hosted 33 webinars and have invited energy thought leaders and experts, both locally and nationally. Then just a quick announcement about the series. While we've had success with these educational webinars for stakeholders, as you can see here, some stats. Moving forward, rather than holding Power Hour on a monthly basis, the agency will use the Power Hour forum to tackle relevant and emerging issues on a case-by-case basis. So please stay tuned for an announcement from the IPA regarding the next Power Hour webinar. This slide gives you an overview on the agency and its responsibilities. The IPA is an independent state agency created in 2007, responsible for the development of an annual electricity procurement plan for customers of electric utilities, and an agency that supports the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, through development and implementation of the Long-Term Renewable Resources Procurement Plan, competitive procurement for utility scale projects, and solar incentive programs for homes and businesses. Now I'd like to welcome all three of our esteemed speakers for today. Our first speaker for the webinar is Jason Stanek, Executive Director of Government Services at PJM Interconnection LLC. He most recently served as Chairman of the Maryland Public Service Commission from 2018 to 2023. Before that, he was Senior Counsel to the Energy Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce, where he advised on matters involving national energy policy with specific focus on electricity issues and the operations of regional power markets. In the past, he also served in senior positions at FERC. Welcome, Jason.
Ryan,
good. Great to have you here, Jason. I'll just go through an introduction of each speaker, but thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Mary Yang, Attorney Advisor at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. In her most recent role, Mary was a legal advisor to FERC Commissioner Allison Clements and specialized in transmission reform, including regional transmission planning, generator interconnection, grid enhancing technologies, and transmission cost management. Before her time with the commissioner, Mary was a trial attorney in FERC's Office of Administrative Litigation, where she litigated natural gas, oil, and electric rates cases before agency administrative law judges. Our final speaker will be Brian Granahan, Director of the Illinois Power Agency. As the IPA's director, Brian oversees the development and implementation of plans to procure electricity and clean energy resources for customers of Illinois electric utilities. Previously, Brian served as the IPA's chief legal counsel, where he oversaw a variety of legal, policy, and strategic responsibilities for the agency. Brian began his career at Sidley Austin Global Law Firm. He also worked as a clean energy advocate and staff attorney with Environment Illinois before shifting to the public sector and serving as a policy advisor to two chairmen at the Illinois Commerce Commission. Now, Jason, I'd like to welcome you to kick off this presentation whenever you're ready.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, Brian, and thanks to IPA for holding this informational and educational seminar. It seems that everybody's talking about transmission planning. Do we have enough power to supply the country's needs? What are the grid operators doing? And of course, what are the regulators, both at the federal level at FERC and at your individual state utility regulator level are doing? So Tori, if we could go to the first slide, just to give folks an overview, PJM is the largest of the 6 grids that operate in the United States and are subject to FERC jurisdiction. We have close to 1,100 members, and we serve 65.
My dad shouldn't.
Oh, no question. About 65 million customers over 14 jurisdictions, including that northeast portion of Illinois you see up top there, the ComEd region. We have a peak load of about 165 gigawatts. Last week, as we had triple digits from Chicago to New York and Baltimore, we saw our peak top out around 155,000 megawatts. So this has been a hot summer. Compared to last year, we're expecting a summer peak that's 4 gigawatts higher than the summer of 2023. Additionally, we have 4 gigawatts less of resources on the system, as we've seen a number of large retirements, such as the Joliet units in Illinois last year. But this is just some facts and figures to get you acquainted with our power grid. On the next slide, for those of you who are new to the industry, this is just an overview schematic, which shows the interaction of transmission, generation, and the distribution system. From PJM's perspective, we operate a control room not far outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where we dispatch power throughout our 14-state region. We are subject to the oversight of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and the lower voltage distribution level assets are subject in your state to the regulatory authority of the Illinois Commerce Commission. In blue, you'll see the high voltage lines, and in yellow, you'll see the smaller distribution lines. Next slide, please. So PJM is not a household name, even though we are a large federally regulated utility. We do not own any assets, but we dispatch the power across transmission owned by large transmission owners, many of these names that you know, such as Exelon and others. Interestingly, we are a not-for-profit, so we are profit neutral, and we are independent by having a board of independent managers that oversees the operations of PJM. In that second circle there, you see that we're not a publicly traded utility. Additionally, all the assets that have been turned over for functional control and operations continue to be the responsibility of those asset owners. So we don't maintain power lines, we don't maintain or repair generating stations. That all is still the full responsibility of those unit owners. And then you'll see on the right side, these are just our governing documents that either we have between our members or we have filed at FERC, which govern all of our interactions and operations to ensure reliability across the grid. On this next slide, you'll see our reason for existence, and it's to maintain reliability on the grid, just like all the other RTOs and ISOs that we have in the country. And these are our three primary focus areas. We oversee the markets across PJM. So the top three markets, although there are additional ones, are the exchange and sale of energy, capacity, and ancillary services. We also maintain operations 24/7 of the grid through our control centers and operations, and we'll focus on that during today's discussion. But most importantly, our focus today is planning, and how do we plan for the system's needs, and what's changing in light of the FERC rule that was just issued last month and will go into effect in August. On this next slide, we'll see just sort of an illustration of these three major components at PJM. We have our transmission planners that are very similar to urban planners, taking a look at factors and influences that could potentially increase the need for additional power lines, increase the need for additional generation. Where do we see the economic development happening in particular parts of our footprint? And how do we get ahead of that? How do we plan to address those needs before those needs actually materialize? Operations, that's a photo of one of our control room operators that operate in shifts. They are on the scene, as I mentioned, 24/7 to ensure that the seamless balance of supply and demand are met and that the lights stay on across our footprint. And then markets, how do we send the proper price signals to ensure that we have sufficient supplies of generation, particularly during the midst of this energy transition, where we see much more in terms of renewable and clean resources replacing thermal and baseload resources that have served us so well for many, many decades. In this next slide, we have a bit of a pinwheel. It shows you that through markets and the efficiencies and opportunity costs that are unborn from markets, we estimate that we save folks in the PJM region $3 to $4 billion a year. And that's through efficiencies gained by energy production costs are lowered, lower emissions through the efficient dispatch of the generating fleet, increased reliability savings by being able to rely on not only your neighbors in PJM, but adjacent regions, which include MISO to the west, New York ISO to the north, and our transmission partners, Duke and Kentucky, to the south of the PJM bordering region. As we move to the next slide here, our discussion today is planning and some of the basics. And at PJM, we have a 15-year RTEP process, and RTEP stands for Regional Transmission Expansion Planning Process. And that process is iterative, it's continuous. Sometimes it's an 18-month process, so they actually overlap. So there are points in times where one process is finishing up and one process is concluding. But we're always looking 15 years ahead of today's date. And FERC will change that somewhat by requiring a 20-year time horizon. But starting at the top, we receive input from so many sources, including our members, including all of the states in our region that have been passing varying laws with respect to decarbonization goals and clean energy. And then planning criteria, which we receive from our reliability organizations such as NERC and Reliability First, which is the ERO that is responsible for PJM's region. These all factor into this RTEP process I mentioned. Moves over to the pink box where we identify particular solutions that we receive from our stakeholders. After looking at potentially dozens of these solutions, the board of PJM goes ahead and they will award some contracts to potential transmission system developers. And then we actually implement the plan at some point. Continuing on, in the next slide, you see from the bottom up, state public policies and the positions of our state are very important in order to develop a really accurate transmission solution to address the needs going forward. So these are just a few of the factors and the influences that we have in terms of making sure that generation can be delivered to serve customer load, that the market signals are efficient and accurate. In that third box there, we are well aware that some of our transmission assets are many, many decades old, 50, 60, 70 years old. And while they served us well, they would need to be replaced at some point in the future. Enhancing performance of the system. And then looking at demand side trends, we see energy efficiency utilized by many in our region, demand response to shave some of the peaks. But we're also seeing increased uses of electric vehicles. We see the proliferation of new large customers such as data centers, AI technology, Bitcoin mining, very energy intensive customers that need to be served because Lord knows we're all on our phones for most of the day, and that uses a tremendous amount of electricity. In our next slide, this illustration, there's a lot of words on the page here, but it shows and demonstrates that the planning process is very holistic and very overlapping. You could likely draw a straight line between any of the petals on this flower here. So we receive injects from our customers, our states, our stakeholders, our policymakers, trying to address several needs. We weigh and balance and review and revise all of these varying factors, and sometimes they are competing factors. But our transmission planners do their best to optimize for both efficiency and economy in terms of cost to customers, because we know that transmission infrastructure is not cheap. But it's an ongoing process so that we are prepared for where we need to be 15 years from today. On the next slide, we have a project that we started about 18 months ago called Long-Term Regional Transmission Planning, or LTRTP, which is somewhat mirrored in the new FERC 1920 directive. And that is scenario-based planning, having multiple scenarios that we could consider today and expect to be where we are in the future. So when I say looking at different scenarios, we could look at scenarios involving public policy on a low end or a high end. We could look at a scenario with respect to baseline transmission planning. And we could look to a scenario of very high intensive load growth. So we effectively cover a number of bases. Those scenarios move into that central cylinder where we look at reliability and economic analysis, and how much is this going to actually cost? How effective will this be at solving for some transmission violations? And then we go ahead and move into the next stage and determine whether it will produce reliable solutions for the grid and get ahead of potential pitfalls that we may see, perhaps unexpected generator retirements, protect against, future-proof against potential legislation, either at the state level or federal level, and have a margin of error that we could feel comfortable with. In the next slide, we mentioned just a moment ago the need to actually get the generation to the load center, or the demand, as we call it in the region. And that's to ensure that we don't have resources such as solar or wind with producing their output, but not being able to effectively send it anywhere. So our transmission planners ensure that the transmission system is sufficiently interconnected so generation in one area of a state could get to another part of the footprint if necessary. In the next slide, load forecasting has been a relatively hot issue and perhaps somewhat controversial. And that's basically, what is our expectation of what the future demand on PJM system will look like at some point in the future, whether it be 1 year, 3 years, 10 years, or 15 years. And we look at a lot of incoming factors in order to determine our best guess of what the future demand on the system will be. We look at the calendar. What day of the week is it? Is it a holiday weekend? Is there a sports event going on that we need to look at? Obviously, January is going to look vastly different than August. Plug-in vehicles. We see a proliferation of EVs in some of our states and regions and not in others. We need to plan for that because EV registrations are going up somewhat exponentially. Weather conditions, we take a look at the weather decades in the past, historic weather, but of course, a lot of the weather patterns we see now in terms of extreme weather have no historical markers. So we look at the forecast, 10-day forecast into the future. So we're looking decades in the past, and we're looking 10 days in the future. Economic conditions, obviously COVID was a factor that we weighted quite considerably, and others on that chart there. And on this next slide, you'll see what the outcome is. There we go. It's rather extreme there. You see for every year since 2016, our load growth has been relatively flat in PJM. But in 2024, when we issued this new chart in January of this year, you could see load growth increasing rather dramatically. And depending on the way your WebEx screen is set up, you should see the 15 years out into the future on the horizontal axis there at the bottom. Why is this happening? We're picking up a lot of demand with respect to data center development in the PJM region, including outside of Northern Virginia, outside of Columbus, Ohio. And this is something that we expect to continue. And we'll take a look and see where the 2025 forecast comes out in January of next year. So stay tuned there. Just have two more quick slides. On the next slide, this is Illinois specific, and more specifically ComEd specific, because that's the territory that we serve. On the left, you see in the goldenrod and the lime green bars, you see ComEd's demand both today and in the green is 10 years from now, so 2034. And remarkably in ComEd, it's going to be relatively flat over the course of 10 years. We're not seeing that in other regions. And on the right side, you see the winter conditions, both in 2024 for ComEd and 2034 for ComEd. On the right side of this slide, you'll see the overall numbers for the PJM system wide. So again, on the summer, you'll see 151 megawatts, which we've actually blown past this summer already. And then in 2034, we see about 177 gigawatts, which is a compound growth rate of about 1.6% per year. Last slide is just a bit of a marketing plug. We do have a really convenient and free app on both Android and for your iPhone there. A simple map that will show you the region, including ComEd region, with respect to the LNPs at any given moment in time. It'll show you net imports and exports, so power flows between the ComEd region and adjacent regions. So it's really handy. It's a simple app. It's not very complicated. So if you're interested, just go to PJM Now on your Apple Store or Android store, and you can download that very easily. Again, thank you for allowing me to present some of the transmission planning basics to the IPA audience today. Thanks again, Brian.
Thanks very much, Jason. I'd now like to invite Mary to discuss the role of FERC in long-term regional transmission planning and unpack FERC Order 1920 at a high level. Mary, the floor is yours when you're ready.
Thank you very much. And unpack at a high level makes the most sense because the order itself is something like 1,200 pages long. Thanks everybody for being here. Like the introduction noted, I am one of the former advisors for Commissioner Clements, who voted for Order 1920. She is currently enjoying a well-deserved break from Energy Matters, and the views here are my own and not those of the commission's. Next slide, please. So this is just quick background for those who don't know FERC as well. We are an independent federal agency. We're based in DC by Union Station. We have a bunch of regional offices, about 1,500 employees. There are 5 commissioners who vote on a variety of opinions and orders and contested proceedings. The chairman is Chairman Phillips, Willie Phillips. My commissioner left last month and 3 started recently. Commissioners Rosner, See, and Chang. They had their first joint open meeting yesterday where each of them spoke a little bit about their upcoming priorities. So that's an interesting video to watch. It's on FERC's website if you have the time to. The jurisdiction of FERC is directed by Congress under several main statutes, and we're talking about the Federal Power Act, the Natural Gas Act, the Interstate Commerce Act. I'm not going to get into all of those today. I'm just going to focus on the portion of the Federal Power Act that gave rise to Order 1920. Next slide, please. All right, so the purpose, I think it's helpful to step back a little bit and ask, why did FERC feel the need to issue Order 1920? How did that process develop? On its very basics, I know Jason covered some of this, transmission planning and cost allocation is a process, sometimes taking many years, where transmission planners identify the needs of their systems using a variety of factors. They consider benefits of particular projects, they select projects, the question of who pays for the project is asked, and there's a long history of FERC precedent on that. FERC has been in transmission planning since, I would say, Order 888 and 890 and Order 1000. So it's been some time since FERC has been involved in transmission planning and cost allocation matters. Order 1920 is the most recent FERC order. About 2 years ago, there was Order 2023, which was a final rule on generator interconnection processes. Apologies, 1 year ago. The new wave of these orders began in 2021 with what was called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. This is where the commission put out a bunch of ideas and said, okay, well, we have some thoughts about how to reform the transmission planning process, some thoughts about generator interconnection reform, grid enhancing technologies, and et cetera. It's a very big set of ideas that was put out. And through various pathways, the commission has begun to finalize right now 2 rules that came out of those set of ideas, 2023 and 1920. Now, the process really involves a range of broad stakeholder input. So there are plenty of opportunities for comments between what is called the ANOPR, the Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and then to the NOPR, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and then finally to the final rule. So it takes some time for these ideas to be developed. There's a public comment process for each of these rules, and FERC held a series of meetings under the Federal State Joint Task Force on Electric Transmission, where FERC commissioners sat down with state commissioners to really talk about some of these issues and how the states are viewing them in their perspective. So the context in which the commission took action, we are at a time when our grid's needs are very different than they were in the past. We have changing resource mix that's moving very quickly. We have, as Jason noted, changes in demand and demand growth. Of course, everyone knows about extreme weather patterns that are impacting different regions at different times during the year. Everything from wildfires in the West to winter storms, et cetera, cybersecurity, physical security, and more. So this is a time when our system needs to adapt and evolve to the changing realities of what we have today. Next slide, please. So in light of all that, what is 1920 trying to accomplish? Now, the order before this one, Order 1000, had it was for some a first step towards this process, but it wasn't entirely effective in driving long-term regional planning. There were existing deficiencies in Order 1000 that led to a system where our transmission system has been built primarily through the interconnection process rather than proactively built, the backbone of our transmission system being built through a forward-looking long-term planning process. I decided to simplify a couple of these themes from 1920 because I think, you know, the order itself is long, but the principles are fairly simple. A couple of these: look far enough ahead. So I'll go over what these reforms really mean. The idea is that further you look ahead, the more you're able to consider the various changes that are coming before you and know when those when your needs might change in the future. And this involves looking at different scenarios. As Jason said, PJMR already does a sort of a version of this. Consider a wide range of factors impacting the needs on your system, a wide range of benefits. FERC has provided 7 different types of benefits that are required to be considered in this process going forward, although, of course, others can be considered. Consider the cheaper stuff first. And my former boss, Commissioner Clements, was a big proponent of using grid enhancing technologies, which are called alternative transmission technologies in 1920. That they're essentially the same thing. Before we consider more expensive upgrades and new greenfield lines. And then finally, really working together with stakeholders and particularly working together with states to find a way to pay for the selected projects. So there's a very there's a cost allocation process, which I will show in the next slide, that will give a sense of how the negotiations will play out. Next slide, please. All right, so the reforms in a nutshell, I went over a couple of these. Order 1920 requires long-term regional transmission planning. All of these details, are there in FERC's website in Order 1920 if you want to learn more about them. But we're talking about 5-year cycles, looking out 20 years, evaluation of 7 different categories of factors, which I can go into, and development of a certain number of scenarios and sensitivities. So that's, like Jason said, looking at high demand scenarios, low demand scenarios, and looking at different types of factors to anticipate the different kinds of needs the system might need in the future. Evaluation of benefits for different types of projects. There are 7 enumerated benefits in Order 1920. One of them in particular, number 6, focuses on extreme weather contingencies, which is new. And these benefits, they're required, but there is flexibility on how transmission planners can measure them. Next, there's an evaluation process with certain selection criteria, which requires consulting with and seeking support from state entities. Now, to be very clear, and this is something that's been talked about a lot when Order 1920 comes up, there is no selection mandate in 1920, which means that projects that come out of this process are not required to be built. So there's to be selected. So there is no mandate for the actual selection. And then there are a couple of other portions of 1920 that are really important, including what I discussed, consideration of certain types of grid enhancing technologies, certain types of transmission needs that may have come up multiple times during the generator interconnection process. There is a set of what I believe are fairly robust transparency provisions for local planning processes. There is a set of provisions for dealing with right-sizing transmission facilities. And for those who aren't aware what that means, it just is thinking about replacing a facility with a higher voltage one, or one that is more efficient and has higher capacity, and what that would look like. There is a large section on how to consider allocating costs. And the standard, however, is the same as what FERC has always used, which is that costs must be allocated roughly commensurate with estimated benefits. This means, as our chairman has said many times since the order was issued, that if you are not benefiting from the project, you're not going to be allocated the cost of that project. And then finally, there are some lighter, I would say, coordination requirements for interregional transmission. This is not an interregional transmission planning rule. The coordination requirements do, however, require regions to start the process of talking with their neighbors about interregional transmission. Next slide, please. Now, there have been a lot of the commentary around Order 1920 in part has focused on, at least in my view, what the role is of states in 1920 and the input of states in 1920. And the way the order was designed gives states more power and more authority, I would say, in transmission planning and cost allocation that they have received under Order 1000 in a variety of areas, particularly cost allocation. Right now, there is, well, when the rule goes into effect, there will be a 6-month engagement period where state entities will discuss and try to come to negotiation for an ex ante cost allocation method. So that's what would the negotiation, what would apply going into the process of planning rather than deciding afterward. And then there are also a couple of other provisions. States have input on long-term scenarios. States are consulted with on evaluation and selection. And of course, the state agreement process is still there. Next slide. I do hear a little bit of background. Okay, great. So this graphic, I think is a helpful one in understanding how the cost allocation negotiation process interacts with the 5-year planning cycle. So there are 5-year planning cycles, meaning that from start to finish, development of scenarios till selection should be done in 5-year cycles. And there are different points along that line when states have opportunities to negotiate cost allocation. We've discussed an ex ante approach that this rule requires early on in the process. There is a state agreement process opportunity after the scenarios are evaluated and analyzed. And there's also, if states cannot come to an agreement on cost allocation, then the ex ante method that was previously negotiated will be used. So it's a helpful visual illustration of how that would work. Next slide, please. So as Jason noted, the rule becomes effective in August at some point. The exact date, it's effective 60 days from publication in the Federal Register. There will be a compliance period, and this sometimes takes a little bit of time. Compliance might come in several different rounds. Each region will be coming in with their own proposal, and the commission will have to issue specific orders for each of those filings. And sometimes that might require 1 or 2 rounds of compliance or more. And there's a 10-month deadline for that and 12 months for interregional requirements. And then separately from compliance, there's implementation, which is when the first 5-year cycle would start. And that's no later than 1 year after the due date of the compliance filing. And of course, as those who are in the FERC world know, there's already an ongoing rehearing process where participants in the ANOPR and the NOPR are able to comment or to request rehearing of portions of 1920 as a part of FERC's process. So the takeaway is that there will be a long road ahead before these reforms will actually result in projects that are built from this process. It might be actually quite a few years before that happens. Next slide. And so finally, this last slide is just to put 1920 in the context of other FERC reforms. The FERC agenda is set by the Chairman Phillips. So he is the one who brings items to vote on the meeting agendas. He's able to direct FERC commission staff to pursue, for instance, certain technical conferences or workshops or things like that. If you listen to what Chairman Phillips has been saying in the last couple of months, it looks like his priorities are going to focus on interregional reform, which is something that Congress has been particularly interested in, including in the recent permitting bill draft that just came out this past week. But this would be both considering interregional reform in a comprehensive way, such as a 1920 comprehensive way, and also a more limited look at minimum transfer capability, which is a conversation that FERC has been having for a while. Hopefully through this process, more interregional reform and better building more lines through interregional reform can get us to a more reliable grid, especially when there are winter storms and contingencies in one region in which they can import from other regions. Grid enhancing technologies is a really big piece that the chair is focused on, particularly dynamic line ratings, and there might be more action in that docket. Deeper interconnection reform is something that my former boss, Allison Clements, has been very interested in. Order 2023, which we didn't really get into today, in my view and in my former boss's view, was not sufficient to solve really some of the tricky problems that are clogging up the interconnection queues today. So there are some workshops that the chairman has announced in the fall that might kickstart a new process to look at deeper reform. And finally, of course, all of this is going to cost a lot of money. So how do we ensure that building out a grid can be done in a cost-effective way? There is an ongoing and open docket on cost management and a related one on transmission incentives, both of which don't have current FERC action, but could in the future. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to take questions after the final presentation, and back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Happy to hear from you today. I'd like to invite Brian now to discuss Illinois initiatives and policies around transmission planning and reform. Welcome, Brian.
Great, thank you, Brian. So as Brian had mentioned at the outset, I'm Brian Granahan. I'm the director of the Illinois Power Agency. I want to thank everyone for coming today and also for attending our Power Hour series more generally. We hope this does provide useful information back to you. This is a little bit of an unusual presentation for me to be giving. Oftentimes I'm talking about IPA initiatives, what's happening through our programs, what's happening through our procurements, what are some of the requirements that apply. And this isn't really the case here because the IPA itself as an agency isn't all that involved in transmission planning. However, we are involved in different processes that do then inform transmission planning decisions. So hopefully I can kind of illuminate some of those things through this presentation. And I also want to thank Jim Zolnarek at the Illinois Commerce Commission, who's very helpful in helping me understand some of the things that the ICC does, because more of the jurisdiction falls to the Illinois Commerce Commission than falls with the IPA. So we go to the first slide that I have for us today. Okay, so how does a state like Illinois play a role in transmission policy development? One of the main places is that to the extent transmission planning decisions are made through regional transmission organizations, the Illinois Commerce Commission has representatives in the Organization of MISO States and in the Organization of PJM States, Inc., OMS and OPSI, and those representatives can make Illinois' needs known through OMS and OPSI. So that's a place in which Illinois has a voice in conversations, and OMS and OPSI will take positions in FERC litigation, but also the Illinois as a state will take positions in FERC litigation as well. That happens both through the Office of Attorney General and it happens through the Illinois Commerce Commission. Those positions are generally focused on ensuring just and reasonable rates, ensuring reliability. Obviously, you can imagine a lot of cost-sharing decisions. Each state has its own unique point of view as to whether costs should be allocated to that state under a certain formula or under a different formula that might be more beneficial to that state. There's also a NARUC and FERC joint task force. NARUC is, of course, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and it kind of is the way in which public utility commissions around the country operate as a network. And that provides for a bridge between this state authority and then also over to federal authority. And then one thing I want to talk a little bit about is the ICC's siting authority, because this is a place where a lot of stuff comes up around transmission projects. Under Section 8-406 of the Public Utilities Act, public utilities and businesses must receive a certificate of public convenience and necessity. So that is oftentimes a place in which the ICC entertains petitions. There's also a determination of a project's necessity available under Section 503 of the Public Utilities Act. And then there's the exercise of eminent domain authority. And as you can imagine, anytime eminent domain is concerned, those tend to be pretty highly contested cases and fairly resource-intensive cases. So that ends up taking a lot of the state's time with respect to transmission planning. So as we move to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the ICC's Renewable Energy Access Plan. Now, the requirement that the ICC produce a Renewable Energy Access Plan is something that came out of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA, back in September of 2021. The first REAP, as it's called, was approved by the ICC in June. This slide outlines some of the different elements of the REAP to give you a substantive overview of what the REAP itself contains. But I want to read a quote from the abstract, at least, as to what, in the ICC's view, the REAP is, and then take a bigger step back and talk about how maybe it bridges the gap between what's happening at the state level and what's happening at the federal level. So the text is, this and future REAP iterations will serve the role of clarifying and quantifying policy requirements and goals, setting clear timelines to meet the goals of CEJA, translating these requirements into the volume of renewable and clean resources needed over time, highlighting attractive renewable energy zones, or REAP zones, within the state across a variety of assessment criteria, identifying and recommending pathways to utilize these zones to inform transmission planning, identifying reforms to transmission interconnection and planning processes needed to ensure that the required resources can be deployed, and identifying potential reforms to regional transmission organization markets to reliably and affordably support Illinois' clean electricity transition. So that is a huge amount of responsibility to have through one document. As we take a bigger step back, the way that I'd like to think about that, at least for transmission planning purposes, is that there's a whole lot of things happening at the state level around the generation mix that the state both has control over and the best visibility into. Nobody knows state policy better than state policymakers. Meanwhile, you have a transmission system where so many decisions are being made through regional transmission planning processes that are overseen by FERC. They're overseen federally under the Federal Power Act. So how do you marry those two? How do you marry what's happening at the state level and what the state is seeking to do with a planning process that ought to be incorporating those inputs? And I think the REAP is one of the best ways that we are bridging that gap and making sure that regional processes are then informed by the state's values and the state's choices in policymaking. So that's how I would think about the REAP for purposes of this discussion. So as we go to the next slide. So what are some of those changes? Well, these are changes to the bulk power system happening in Illinois on both the supply side, with new resources coming online, or happening in terms of new supply coming online, and then also happening in terms of market exits that are being mandated through decarbonization requirements. So just to give you some sense, at least, of what the IPA is doing to facilitate the development of new renewables, we have what we call our index REC procurements, where we provide REC delivery contracts for the development of new utility-scale wind projects, new utility-scale solar projects, and also brownfield site solar projects. And this gives you a sense on this slide of what some of the quantities we expect over time to come online just through RPS activities. Now, one of the primary things to remember here is that this is just the Illinois RPS, and that's important for two reasons. The first is that there's a lot of merchant project activity that takes place outside of the RPS. For example, in Illinois, we have about 7,500 megawatts of wind, or 7,900 megawatts of wind presently. Most of that wind does not sell RECs into the Illinois RPS, so those projects are not reflected in these goals. We're starting to see that happen with a few utility-scale solar projects as well. So this may be thought of as something of a minimum, but it's not necessarily the full picture of how the generation mix is changing. It's also the case that under the Illinois RPS, it's possible for adjacent state projects to participate. So you may have projects selling RECs in the Illinois RPS that are not located in Illinois. So on both ends, the math will be a little bit off from our RPS goals in terms of how the overall generation mix is changing. But you are talking about, in terms of utility scale projects, nearly 15,000 megawatts of new utility scale solar and utility scale wind coming online as part of the generation mix in or near Illinois. And that's a huge shift over time. And you can imagine how that type of information should then inform transmission planning. And as we go to the next slide. So then there's the issue of the market exits. Through CEJA, Illinois adopted a 100% clean energy by 2050 requirement. One of the main things to note here is that nuclear power under that definition does meet the definition of clean energy. So we have 6 nuclear plants in Illinois, 11 reactors. We produce more nuclear power than any state in the country. Now, 5 of those plants are located in PJM. 1 is located in MISO. So as we think about market entries and exits, you can see how this might present a more acute problem in the MISO portion of the state, where they don't have all of this baseload clean energy that's remaining online. Again, we have a 50% RPS by 2040. And then we're seeking the retirement of coal plants by 2030, outside of a few exceptions here and there that goes out to 2045, and then gas plants are winding down thereafter. So this is what's happening to the generation mix in Illinois that then is feeding into something like the REAP, which is then feeding into transmission planning processes where the state's taking certain positions or making the RTOs aware of where the state is headed and what the state's needs are. So we have this kind of structure in Illinois as an input into those regional planning processes. So go to the next slide. So one of the things that we can do is we're required to do by law is the IPA, the IEPA, and the ICC are to take a look at this decarbonization schedule. Will this provide any challenges back with respect to resource adequacy and reliability? Under Section 9.15.0 of the IEPA Act, we take a look at this and publish a report by December 15th, 2025, identifying if this decarbonization across the next 5 years is likely to trigger any sort of problems. And if it is, then develop a plan associated with what we end up doing about it. Now, one of the important things to know about that planning process is that I think in the filing with the ICC, the one option that's available is relaxing decarbonization standards and those sorts of environmental policy changes. But we can also develop a plan for what to do that might then inform the legislature and say, well, here's the different suite of alternatives we have available in terms of more supply entering the market or other non-generation alternatives. And the state was recently the recipient of some climate pollution reduction grant funding federally. I believe that was announced earlier this week. And I think one of the components that we put into that grant application was for planning, basically in the 2025 to 2030 time period, around what are the best options for Illinois in terms of meeting increasing load while at the same time trying to maintain integrity to our environmental requirements. So this is something that will be a big part of the IPA's work and a big part of a number of state agencies' work over the coming years. As it stands right now, we've had a couple of preliminary meetings with the IEPA and the ICC, but right now we have a procurement planning consultant RFP out right now, and that's a big part of that RFP process is saying we need to make sure that we have a good consultant in place to do this type of work. Let's go to the next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit, just briefly, about some state legislative proposals from 2024 that are intended to support the development of discrete transmission projects. This is something that we haven't seen too much of previously, but it'll probably be a pretty big part of discussions around omnibus energy legislation going forward. So we have HB 5514 on the one hand, and we did see a draft of a bill like that in 2023, as I'll get into on the next slide, and SB 3949 on the other. What's notable about these bills is that they both use a similar model to support the development of new clean energy generation as we see through our index REC process. It's all REC based. It's all basically the utilities taking contracts to RECs and making payments back to provide incentive capital to achieve certain requirements. Now, HB 5514 is pretty specific in that it's supporting an underground transmission line with 100 miles of underground lines in Illinois, whereas SB 3949 is more of an open-ended competitive procurement. Both feature HVDC REC contracts of at least 25 years. They're both longer-term contracts than you see otherwise. For HB 5514, the way in which all of this is priced out is focused more on the transmission lines development, whereas SB 3949 is focused more like the index REC model on the generator's revenues. So there's a pretty big difference between the two from that standpoint. And HB 5514 also has the Capital Development Board involved in assessing what the likely costs are going to be of that transmission line and using that to inform the maximum possible price that can be paid through HVDC REC contracts. So different models, but both have been introduced in the General Assembly in 2024. Please go to the next slide. So HB 5514 looks to be used to support the development of the Sioux Green project, which would run a high voltage direct current transmission line from around Mason City, Iowa over to Plano, Illinois, with generation on the Iowa side of it, and then a converter station on the Illinois end. And back in 2023, the IPA was asked to study this policy along with two other policies as part of three proposals that were made in the 2023 legislative session and asked to assess them around a bunch of different qualitative criteria. This is all written into the law of things that we should be basically assessing the marginal impacts of these three policies based on this criteria. I've linked our policy study in the slides. That's probably the best place to get the full picture associated with our assessment of that draft Sioux Green legislation. And even though that bill hadn't been introduced at that point, What we ended up studying looked a lot like HB 5514 before its first amendment. So it looked like it mirrored basically that bill that was initially introduced. You saw lots of positive impacts on reliability in the environment and positive economic impacts. You also saw a strike price of about $115 per megawatt hour is what we estimated this bill was likely to cost. Now, it's important to note that all the inputs from this are basically taken from 2023 as we're developing the policy study. The picture can change over time. Even the bill itself has changed over time. But that was our assessment at the time. As a point of comparison, our most recent index rec procurement, where I believe the results were published on Wednesday, that featured a strike price of around $73 per megawatt hour, doesn't offer the same suite of solutions back when we conduct that type of procurement as a policy like this might, but it gives you some point of comparison in terms of the costs. So all of that is available on the IPA's website, our policy study analysis. And then moving to the next slide. Then the question becomes, where do we go from here? So we have these different processes going on before the ICC. We have the development of the REAP. We have different regional transmission planning processes. And then we have these bills introduced, which would facilitate the development or help facilitate the development of new high voltage direct current transmission lines. So what happens from here? If legislation is required to support these projects, is that something the legislature is likely to take up a vote on? I think it ends up in the bucket of a number of different issues where we've seen energy bills introduced over the last, say, 18 months. And this includes comprehensive storage legislation and offshore wind legislation, both of which were also studied as part of the policy study. Additional reforms of the RPS, changes to our capacity procurement processes, changes to the self-direct program. This is just a very limited survey of the sorts of issues that right now we've seen bills introduced about, and we expect some conversations to happen around in the coming months as we might work toward an omnibus energy bill. The next formal meeting dates for the Illinois General Assembly are November 12th to the 14th and November 19th to 21st. There's always the possibility of what we call lame duck session days thereafter. Those are days that the legislature meets after the elections, after everyone's already gone through the electoral process, usually in like early January or so, where they meet and they take up some challenging issues. So we could see those sorts of session days too in January. And then the new General Assembly usually kicks off, I believe, in mid-January of the next year. So that's what the path looks like in terms of legislation as we go to the end. So that's the end of my slides, and I hope that was a helpful overview, and happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Brian. We'll display some contact info for our speakers in just a moment, but with limited time remaining, we'll move right into the Q&A session. We have a resource shared in the chat, an article from RTO Insider, so thank you for that, Scott. We also have one question so far on nuclear from Todd Volker. Todd asks, how soon can we get mini nuclear in Illinois?
It's a difficult question. I think there was a moratorium in place on the development of any new nuclear plants. And that moratorium was lifted with respect to plants below a certain size threshold. I want to say it was 300 megawatts. I could be wrong about that. That bill was signed into law by the governor last year. The process for ensuring or facilitating the development of a new nuclear plant would probably require other enabling legislation to ensure that that plant has the necessary revenue certainty. As a restructured state, we don't have the ability to make these sorts of decisions before a state public utilities commission. So you would need some way to ensure that that plant was able to recover its likely capital development costs from ratepayers, including from ratepayers of retail suppliers and ratepayers who have default supply service. And you'd need to see a bill like that come together. What we have seen in other states, in Michigan, most notably regionally, is where they are seeking the development of additional nuclear power. They are looking at taking decommissioned plants and reactivating those plants. So that's been a point of a lot of focus recently in Michigan. Have not heard that discussion come up in Illinois, but it's just an interesting data point getting at the same challenges.
Thank you, Brian. We have another question from Sarah directed toward Mr. Stanek. If you can say a little bit more about PJM's activities to facilitate new Transmission.
Thanks, Sarah, for the question. Good question. We we do need more transmission built across the PJM footprint. Illinois and almost every other state needs some new transmission. Transmission falls into one of a number of categories, whether it's a baseline project, if it's a network upgrade, if it's a supplemental project. But what we do to encourage transmission is send the proper price signals and to ensure that projects are properly awarded. So this is a continual process that we handle through the planning process that I mentioned earlier. But we've been on record for the past several years now that transmission is in need in terms of replacing some of the older transmission and building out transmission to serve new loads. So between the price signals and the returns that some of these transmission owners could get to serve load, I think they have the proper incentives in place.
Thanks again, Jason, and thanks for your questions, Sarah and Todd. We'll take this one last question since we're at time from Todd Volker. A follow-up: is it possible to see projected large-scale electric projects in Illinois? Are these filed and available to the public?
So I have to admit, for the Illinois Power Agency, we end up having to learn about a lot of these things through press releases and through industry articles, because there's no disclosure that's required to us if somebody wants to stand up not just say a new natural gas plant, but also a new renewable project. We find out about certain new renewable projects through our procurement events. When someone applies for a direct delivery contract, puts a bid in, that's how we find out that that project is under development, and then we try to track those projects from there. I do want to highlight a new project that we have coming up at the IPA, our Clean Energy Dashboard. And the idea behind the Clean Energy Dashboard is not necessarily to provide visibility into all projects that are under development in Illinois, but it would at least provide visibility into those renewable energy projects that we're aware of or that the IPA is supporting. We have maps and interactive tools that allow you to navigate yourself where projects are, at what size, but that's probably not going to tell you the full picture of all large-scale generation.
Looking forward to that as well. Thank you, Brian. I want to thank all our speakers today and all of our attendees for joining the session. This webinar wouldn't have been possible without the support of the agency's stakeholders who have taken a keen interest in participating. Please stay tuned for an announcement from the IPA regarding the next Power Hour webinar. Thank you, everybody.